Hello and welcome to Code with JV. Today I'm going to be talking about how to call APIs from your code. With this simple tool, you can go from creating scripts which read your file system or do a bit of logic, talk to a database, to talking to every website on the internet. And you can start to upgrade your capabilities phenomenally just by knowing how to call APIs. It's a little bit to learn. Let's jump into it. The first thing I want to talk about is HTTP. Then we'll talk about public APIs, ones you can call without authenticating or needing an API key. The next we'll talk about is authenticated APIs, ones which you need an API key to use. Finally, I'll talk about fancy auth APIs, or ones which use a technology known as OAuth. As a companion for today's video, I have made a bunch of sample learning plans for calling APIs. They're in JavaScript, Python, and Rust because that's what a lot of people are using. They're fairly similar to each other. If you're using another language, it's pretty easy just to get this, give it to ChatGPT and say, hey, give me this in Go or whatever you're interested in. This has a fairly in-depth overview of APIs with some good practical exercises. So, HTTP, foundational technology that makes the World Wide Web. It's built around the concept of a server. The server is a computer running a program waiting for people to talk to it. It doesn't matter what the server's built in. It doesn't matter what the client's built in. They talk using this protocol. The client is code which talks to the server to get information from it, to save information to it. A client could be many types of code. It could be a browser. It could be a mobile app. It could be a terminal command using curl. It could be your code. HTTP doesn't care what type of application the client is. It just wants it to talk in the format of HTTP, which is why it's a protocol. So in HTTP, a client talks to the server by making a request. A request can have a whole bunch of information in it, but there are two key parts. The first one is the verb plus the path. In HTTP, there's a thing called verbs, and that means it could be a GET request for getting data, POST for saving it, PUT for updating, delete for getting rid of it. It's also got another common one called PATCH. There's a whole bunch of them. These are the most common ones you'll see, and these are describing the type of request it is. I want you to give me information, server. Or server, please get rid of this information or save this information. That's the verb part of it, and the path is everything that comes after the URL. So if you go to codewithjv.com/newsletter, excellent choice, highly recommend you sign up for it. Everything that comes after the .com, that is the path. Everything that comes before it is the address of the server. This is how your client knows what server it's talking to in the first place. That's the key information that gets passed to the server, is the verb and the path. There's other stuff too, but you can learn that later. And then the server responds with a response. You'll have a status code and a body. So a status code could be things like 200. Everything worked fine. Here's the information you want. 404. Seen that before? Your page isn't found. I can't find the thing you want. 500. There was some kind of server error. You can ask ChatGPT for more information about these status codes. A really good place to go, though, is the Wikipedia status codes. I find this is just a great resource to look through and understand a bit more about the status codes and what they do. This is the core of HTTP. You have programs living on computers. They're servers. They're just running, waiting for someone to talk to them. You have client programs which initiate the conversation. They send a bunch of information to the server. They get back a bunch of information. And this is how the web works. This is the same way that you call APIs. Let's jump into the terminal for a demo. I just want the terminal for now. We'll write some code in a little bit. Remember that application I mentioned called curl? You can download it into your terminal, and it is a simple way to call HTTP APIs. You can start to do codewithjv.com. It's talking to it, and when you do curl with no other information, it just shows you the stuff that it gets. So here's a simple web page saying, hey, this content doesn't live here, it's actually over here. That's because I use a landing page for managing the website, because, hey, I'm still building the thing. If you go curl-v, then it's going to show you a bit more of the information, and this is what HTTP is. It sends text like this. So HTTP is just the format of text. And it's saying I'm using this version of HTTP. I want this page using a GET request. The server responds with thank you. 302 is the status. This lives somewhere else. You want to go over here to find the thing you're looking for. And it sends back a body as well. This is what is happening under the hood when you go into your browser and you type a domain name. So let's jump over to ChatGPT and get it to write some API code for us. Hey ChatGPT, talk to the GitHub API, use curl. I want to see the trending repos. This is where it can generate the command for you, but also it knows the URL to call. All of this has a lot of knowledge baked into it. It knows a bunch about the GitHub API. A lot of websites will have an API dot in front of it for where all the API code lives. And if we copy this talk to the API, well, hey, we're seeing the results. This is what the GitHub API returns with when you say, give me a list of your trending repositories. And it's not that easy to read. One of the ways I think about APIs is that they are interfaces for computer users. There is a whole craft dedicated to making websites and mobile apps usable for people. So design, usability, it's a whole domain. It's optimized for humans to consume and interact with that application. Well, APIs are optimized for computers to use and interact with that application. So when you hit an API, often you'll get reams of JavaScript coming back at you, and it takes a bit to pass them. So the work you're doing is, how do I get the information I want? How do I put the information I want in? And how do I format it in a way that I can do useful jobs with it? In this case, the GitHub API gives us all this JSON data. You can see these open squiggle brackets, the quotes, colons. It's a very common format for APIs. If we want to turn this into something useful, typically we massage it a little bit. If you're doing things in the terminal, and again, this is useful only for sort of playing around with APIs, there's a JQ library which you can get for your terminal. It essentially passes JSON. This is where it's going to add an extra thing on the end just to get the information you want out of it. ChatGPT has figured out the parts of the information you care about to achieve your task. It saves you so much time. Paste it in. It's got the JQ filter on it. Here you'll start to see, AutoGPT, NoGPT. So a bunch of the AI repos, they're trending, which makes sense given our time we're in. But here I have filtered down the information to just the stuff I want. And this is just using a terminal command. So you can explore publicly accessible APIs with pretty much zero code. If ChatGPT doesn't know the API, you can paste in the API documentation and say, write me a curl command, use JQ, and it will start to spit out information. So you can poke the API and say, does it look like what I want? In the learning plan I attached, I also mentioned a tool called Insomnia, which is a user interface for doing the same sort of thing. Let's write some Python code. And by us, I mean, hey, ChatGPT, write us some Python code. This is a lot more easy to read to understand what's going on in the curl commands. You can see that it's using a requests library. This is the URL it's going to. These are the parameters it's passing to it. And this is how it's getting the data from the JSON at the end. I'm going to make a new script, call it popular, paste in the ChatGPT code, Python popular. Same sort of thing going on. But again, it's a bit easier to format the output because you can control it, it's Python, etc. The same stuff is going on here under the hood. Hey, now we're calling public APIs. What if we want to call a private API? This is where the only real difference between the code is in a public API, you can just call a URL and get stuff back. In a private one, you need to pass down some data which proves you have access to it. Typically, this is called an API token or an access token. You include that in your call, and then it's the same thing. In GitHub, one of the things you can do is you can create repos. Write me a script to create a new GitHub repo. Here you'll see it's got requests, and now it's got this idea of a token. It's using this URL, and down here it's saying put your access token here. This is the name, description. Hey, decent script. Let's grab it. I'm going to call this one new.py. If I run this at the moment, it's going to give me an error because the token's not legit, right? Notice the white dot means I have to save the file. Okay, the white dot's gone, which means the file's saved properly. And failed to create a message, bad credentials. Makes sense, didn't put any in. To get the access token is different for every API or every website. If you don't know how to do it, the first thing you can try is, hey, ChatGPT, it knows a lot about different websites and can give you descriptions which are pretty good. For GitHub, I'll just show you how it works. In your browser, go to GitHub. You'll find your username up here, settings. Right down the bottom, you can get your developer settings, personal access tokens, and here when you make a token, depending on the site you're using, often it will have a whole bunch of different options. So I'm just going to call this demo. Let's expire it in 7 days. I'm deleting it after the video, so it doesn't matter. This is where GitHub wants to say, well, what permissions do you want this token to be able to do? Right now, this is just a read-only token. But you can say, well, for all repos, really, I just want repository creation. This is a fairly powerful token I'm creating. With this token, it could delete every repo that I've created. So pay attention to the code you're writing and the tokens you're creating. If you make an error or they get into the wrong hands, they can have consequences. In particular, you want to be really careful who you share it with. And if you make a YouTube video, I'm deleting it after this, don't worry. Now I've got hold of that string, my script is enabled to create and delete repos in GitHub. If we go here, make sure you get a clean paste in and you don't have any extra bits around it, or your token's going to be incorrect. Now, let's see if we can make a new repo. My code says it was created. What does the web say? Go to repositories. Here we have my new repo. This is where I'm starting to write code and starting to interact with GitHub. That's all well and good. There's not much difference. Once you get your tokens, you can put them into your scripts. Now, if you're just writing a script and you're never getting it off your computer, storing it in there is okay, but it's kind of not a great practice. Because maybe one day you start to use that script and you want to share it with someone, and you forget you've put your token in it. Or maybe you start to save it in GitHub and you forget your tokens in there, and all of a sudden someone can find that token and use it. In this case, they'd be able to delete all my repos. Or if it was my OpenAI API token, they'd be able to rack up a bill on my credit card, which people have totally done. GitHub now has a script which scans for when you're saving tokens to warn you, saying, did you mean to save your token? Because in the past, people have written bots to look in open source repos for AWS tokens, and they use them to store stuff on Amazon Web Services. It's a big problem. So there's a set of best practices about how to store your tokens, which is you never store them with your code. The way you store them, you want to make it secure. Let's learn how to do that. The key way of doing it is you store the token in your environment, not in your script. You can ask ChatGPT for more of a lesson on environment variables in the terminal, but a very common way of doing it is using a library called .env. This is popular in pretty much most languages. The way it works is in your code, you make a new file, you call it .env. It's just a key value pair file. You can take your access token, and here I'm going to grab the token, save it in the file. Then when we paste in the code from ChatGPT, you'll see it's pretty much the same stuff, except down here, here's the access token. And it's not hard-coded in, it's getting it from this .env values, which is loaded from up here. And this is a way that it will read the .env file. When I save this code to GitHub, I can save the new.py, but I won't save the .env. A quick tip on how to do that is you can create a gitignore file, which just lists out the things you don't want to be saved to GitHub. But hey, learn that when you learn Git. With that, I am now saving it in my environment rather than in my code. That's a much more secure way of storing your API code. That's a little bit about HTTP. We've seen a bit about public APIs and authenticated APIs. Same thing, just one's got an access token and one doesn't. There's another category of APIs you might bump into, and ChatGPT will lead you into them quite quickly, depending on the project you use. But essentially, if you've got your code, then you have some user who's using your code, then you have an API provider like Google or Facebook or Twitter, are common ones. This type of authentication is essentially a three-way conversation between these entities that ends up with your code having access to a user API token. This is called OAuth. You can learn a whole bunch about how to implement it if you're interested. It's a protocol for exchanging keys and basically a user to say, hey, this code over here, Twitter, I want you to give my token to this code, and a way for Twitter to do that in a safe way. Then you can get a user API token per user, so you can do things on their behalf. Like I could create an app which lets you create repositories in GitHub if you gave me the right token. To do that, before you set up any code, essentially you have to go to the API provider and you have to register an application. And they will start to look at your application and say, is this legit? What sort of permissions do you want to use? And then they'll say, okay, if it's legit, here you go. Here's your application token. So if you start to try and do stuff with the Gmail API, for example, this is the only way you can get an API token. Hey, I want a script which counts my unread emails in Gmail. And ChatGPT won't really say, hey, we're using fancy auth now. It will just start to say, well, here's some code. But you'll see this OAuth 2 stuff showing up. You'll see some things about here, okay, this is the scopes we need. Just realize as soon as you're going into OAuth land, you're starting to get into the situation where you probably need to register an app for this to work. Before running the script, you'll need to go to the developer console. You'll need to install the right libraries. You'll need to get yourself an OAuth client credentials. It gives you some good tips. But this is a slightly different and heavier way of interacting with an API. You should be able to follow the tips and start going there, and I was able to get something which counts my Gmail quite quickly. So that's a quick introduction to APIs. Like I said at the beginning, once you know how to use APIs, you can start to build useful scripts, or more importantly, you can guide ChatGPT to write useful scripts for you. And your imagination really is the limit. You can ask ChatGPT, give me a list of public APIs. There is so many public APIs out there. You can find out where the space station is at any given time using an API. You can look up the weather. You can generate cartoons. You can talk to AI agents. It's worth really getting your head around HTTP and APIs and make sure you understand the concepts, because if you got them square, you'll be able to solve any errors that come your way. If you like the video, give it a like, thumbs up, give us a subscribe. APIs are one of those things where your imagination really is the limit. So have fun, happy coding, take care.